Every single time we see a player retire, it seems the media and the fans are looking for the next star to replace the role they've left, often handing youngsters a title along the lines of the Croatian Messi or the American Pele. We even saw a few years back the English Neymar, but what if I told you that English football had already seen its Neymar, and it's back in the 60s? See, the thing is, the man I'm talking about was the Neymar before Neymar existed. His name? Eddie Gray. Born in a region of Glasgow known as Castlemilk, which derives from a Gaelic phrase on screen now, Eddie had dreams of playing for Celtic, the team he supported as a child, but was unfortunate enough to come through the ranks in the late 60s when Celtic had built one of the best squads in British football history, meaning Eddie would then move to Leeds at the age of 16 and would stay there for his entire career. Gray would make his debut for Leeds on New Year's Day 1966 at the age of just 17, and from that moment forward would consistently find himself in the Leeds side. In 2000 he would be voted as Leeds' third greatest player ever, beating club legends like all-time top scorer Peter Lorimer, Jack Charlton and Norman Hunter, only finishing behind one of the greatest British players of all time, John Charles, and Eddie Gray's own captain, Billy Bremner. To find yourself with such plaudits, you'd clearly have to be a great player, and that Eddie Gray was. Most often found on the left flank, Gray was one of Britain's first tricky technical wingers. He had speed, skill and spatial awareness, and had feet so quick and light, he was nicknamed as the man who left no footprints. To put it simply, he was like a Brazilian Glaswegian. Now moving on to his debut. Having spent half a year playing in the youth teams, Gray was finally given his opportunity, starting in a 3-0 win against Sheffield Wednesday. Oh, and I forgot to mention, he of course would score on his debut, the first of many goals to come. Eddie Gray would make 2 more appearances for Leeds that season, with the club going on to finish second. It's also important to mention that Gray joined the club during the middle of Don Revie's very successful period in charge, making it particularly impressive that Gray had managed to break into the starting 11. The 66-67 season would be a slightly disappointing one for Leeds. The club only managed a 4th place finish. However, on a personal level, the 66-67 season would be a great one for Eddie. He made 40 appearances in all competitions, scoring 4 goals in his 29 league appearances alone, whilst playing as a pure winger. It'd be around this time when a certain phrase would start to be used to describe Eddie, the last waltz. The phrase would become the winger's nickname, referring to his incredible technical skills and the way he'd be able to almost dance between defenders. He'd be the beauty to the Leeds beast, as a standout technician in a physically dominant side. Sadly, once again for Leeds, the 67-68 season would be one of disappointment in the league, finishing 4th for the 2nd season running, but this time round for good reason. In January 1968, Leeds came up against Derby in the League Cup semi-final, winning 1-0 away from home in the first leg against the Brian Clough side, which became infamous for being the complete opposite of what Leeds stood for. Clough wanted his sides playing beautiful attacking football, whereas Don Revie wanted to win by any means necessary. On this occasion, Revie's Leeds side would come out on top, winning the second leg 3-2 at home, in a game which saw one of the earliest examples of an Eddie Gray mesmerising solo run. In the final, Leeds came up against Arsenal and were clear favourites. The Gunners were a long way from their glory days in the 30s. Arsenal had failed to finish higher than 7th in their last 9 seasons, and had made their first cup final since 1950. Eddie Gray started for Leeds in front of a Wembley Stadium filled to the brim with 97,887 fans. Legendary left-back Terry Cooper scored the only goal of the game as Leeds won 1-0 in a massively scrappy and unattractive game, a perfect example of the Leeds side at the time. But the Whites weren't done there, as they looked to be the only side to make both the FA Cup and League Cup final in one season. After beating sides like Nottingham Forest, Sheffield United and another fierce clash against Derby County, Leeds had made the semi-final against Everton, a team they'd finished just 1 point ahead of in the league. Like you'd expect, the game was tight, and approaching half-time there'd be very few if any real chances. Cue a rare mistake from Leeds goalkeeper Gary Spray. He miscued his kick with the ball going straight to Everton forward Jimmy Husband. The Everton man shot towards an empty goal, with Jack Charlton being forced to stop the ball with his hand, giving Everton a penalty. The Toffee scored it, making it 1-0. Immediately after conceding, Leeds went up the other end, as Terry Cooper managed to take the ball about 30 yards towards the Everton goal, smashing a shot past the Everton keeper, but not the bar, as the ball smashed the woodwork and Everton held a 1-0 lead going into the second half. In the second half, Eddie Gray struggled to make an impact being subbed off, and Leeds were unable to break down the Everton defence, as the Toffees made it to the FA Cup final. Despite missing out on the FA Cup and any league success, Leeds weren't dejected, as they still had one more competition to focus on, the Intercities Fairs Cup. Leeds had made another semi-final that season, meeting Scotland's Dundee FC. The first leg was a 1-1 draw in Scotland, meaning everything was on the return tie at Ellen Road on the 15th of May 1968. The game was extremely tight, with no team having broke the deadlock at half-time. The 50th, 60th and 70th minutes followed, with nobody having scored. Then in the 80th, stepped forward a 20-year-old Eddie Gray, smashing the ball into the Dundee net, winning Leeds the game and sending them to the final, where they'd come up against Ferencváros of Hungary, the side who'd won the tournament just a few seasons before. The final was a 2-legged affair, in which the fixture came to Ellen Road first. Leeds won 1-0 thanks to a 41st minute Mick Jones goal, with the Whites keeping a 6th clean sheet of their European campaign. The club would have to wait over a month for the next fixture though, where disaster struck. Eddie Gray, who'd been so important for their run to the final, was injured and would miss the final game, which took place in front of 76,000 Hungarian fans in Budapest. It would take a monumental effort for Leeds to stay ahead in the tie, and having struggled to break down Ferencváros in the first leg, and without their star creative outlet, you'd be forgiven for thinking that despite being a goal up, it was a mountain too hard to climb for Don Reevy's men. But against all expectations, the game remained goalless going into the second half. Come the 80th minute, the same time Gray had scored the winner in the first leg, Don Reevy said the minutes began feeling like hours. 5 minutes later, Jack Charlton and the fellow Leeds defenders still hadn't conceded. Another 5 minutes, still no goal. And in the final moments of the game, Ferencváros was still unable to score. Leeds had done it. They'd won their first ever European honour, and despite Gray not playing the final, the Glaswegian genius had played a huge role. Remember that he was still only 20 and had won 2 trophies in his second full season as a professional. Delays to the final meant the Fairs Cup had overlapped into the 68-69 season. Going into the 14th match day, Leeds had won 10 and lost just once, finding themselves top of the league. But then a terrible run of form would hit. On the 19th of October, Leeds were demolished, losing 5-1 to Burnley away from home. They then drew the 3 games that followed, only winning 3 of their next 9. This huge hiccup had let a few teams back into the title race, notably both of the Liverpudlian sides, Liverpool and Everton. Liverpool capitalised on this poor form from Leeds, going top of the league, however had played 2 more games than the rest of the pack. On the other side of Leeds were Everton, who were scoring goals for fun and had a clearly superior goal difference. Things weren't going to exactly ease up for Leeds in the upcoming fixtures either, coming up against Burnley, who'd just battered them a couple months prior, as well as well-placed Newcastle and Tottenham, and European champions Man United. Similarly to the second leg against Ferencváros, it would take another monumental effort if Leeds wanted to win the league and overcome this bump in form. Then, they won 3 of their next 4 and 14 of their final 20 games, not losing again for the rest of the campaign. Once again, Don Reevy's Leeds had done it, but this time they were champions of England, probably their biggest feat yet. Eddie Gray made 33 appearances, scoring 5 times. At the age of just 21, the man from Scotland had conquered England. Not only had Eddie and Leeds won the league, but they'd done it in style, finishing 6 points ahead of Liverpool, in a time where wins only counted as 2 points. But not only this, Leeds had broken the record for the most points in one season, and ended the season 27 points ahead of the previous year's champions Man City. But even after all these accomplishments, Eddie still hadn't made his most iconic appearance in a Leeds shirt. That would come in the upcoming 69-70 season. Now in the European Cup, Leeds were chasing an iconic treble, something no team in world football had done before. Fast forward to March the 23rd, 1970, and Leeds found themselves in the FA Cup semi-final, the European Cup semi-final, and just 3 points behind Everton in the title race with a game in hand. Funnily enough, Leeds had already played the semi-final against Man United, drawing 0-0 at Hillsborough, meaning the game on the 23rd of March was actually a replay, which they drew 0-0 again. And finally in the second replay, Leeds won 1-0 through a Billy Bremner goal in the 9th minute, the only goal in 330 minutes of football between the two sides. Although despite having won the battle against Man United, they may have lost the war. Having focused all their energy on the 3 fixtures in the FA Cup, Leeds dropped off in the league. And despite Gray managing 9 goals in 30 league games, the Whites lost 4 of their final 6, winning just once, and ended the season 9 points behind Everton. You may have noticed earlier I didn't mention who Leeds would come up against in the European Cup. That's because it was none other than Celtic, Eddie Gray's childhood side, and the team he dreamt of playing for, but couldn't break into. The first leg would end 1-0 to Celtic at Ellen Road, with a goal from George Connolly in the first minute being enough to take the win on the day. Then moving up to the second leg in Scotland, despite having equalised in the first half for a Billy Bremner screamer, Celtic won 2-1, knocking Leeds and Eddie Gray out of the European Cup. Having now missed out on 3 competitions this season, Gray was desperate to win the FA Cup. A few weeks earlier, Gray had played maybe his best ever game for Leeds against Burnley, scoring 2 incredible goals. The first being a chip from about 30 yards out, but the second, well, I'll let the video do the talking.
Eddie Gray. Oh, good footwork by Gray, still going. Oh, let it go, what a masterly goal by Eddie Gray.
It's fair to say going into the final, Gray was confident. Probably in the best form of his career, Eddie would come up against Chelsea's David Webb. Gray was said to have tormented Webb, turning him time and time again. Gray would also take the corner that led to the first goal of the game, and come the 84th minute, Mick Jones would score to make it 2-1 to Leeds with just minutes left. Leeds had completely dominated the game, but in the 86th minute, Chelsea equalised again, taking the game to a replay. In the replay, Chelsea would change the man marking Eddie Gray to Ron Harris, nicknamed the Chopper for his ruthless style of defending. Harris would go through the back of Gray's knee, injuring him in the process, and Chelsea would go on to win the replay 2-1, with Gray unable to help. This injury would start Gray's long and never-ending battle with injuries over the rest of his career, only making over 30 appearances in the league once in his next 9 seasons. The next season, Gray would play just 18 league games, with Leeds missing out on the title by just 1 point, where you can't help but think, had Gray been fit for even 10 more games, Leeds would have won their second league title in Gray's time at the club. In the 71-72 season, Leeds would come second for the third season in a row, but would win the FA Cup, meaning they'd won silverware for the second season in a row, having won the final ever Intercities Fair Cup the campaign prior. The next season, Gray would again miss out on important games, none more so than a 1-0 loss in the Cup Winners' Cup final, where Leeds had requested for the match be replayed following various poor decisions from the ref. The 73-74 season would be filled with mixed emotions for Gray, as Leeds won the title by 5 points, but Gray would make just 9 appearances in all competitions, his most injury-ridden campaign in his career. This would in fact be the final time Leeds would finish in the top 4 in Gray's career, with legendary Don Revie leaving the club at the end of the season. The next season would see Jimmy Arfield take over as manager, but nonetheless, Eddie Gray would still be as magical on the ball as always. Leeds struggled massively in England, finishing 9th and not making it past the quarters in any domestic competition. But in Europe, things were different. Leeds had made the European Cup semi-final against Barcelona, where Gray would be the dominant attacking force in a game where the legendary Johan Cruyff would be playing for Barcelona. Leeds won the game 2-1, but in a baffling decision, Gray wouldn't be selected for either the semi-final second leg, which Leeds drew 1-1, or the final, which Leeds lost 2-0 in extremely controversial circumstances. A series of remarkably poor decisions from the referee led to riots from Leeds fans after the game, who believed they'd been cheated out of seeing their team become champions of Europe. This would sadly be the last real story of any relative success for Gray, despite having not actually won the cup, and sadly in 81-82, Leeds would be relegated to the second tier. But Gray would still show how special he was during this time. What made Gray so remarkable was not just his skill on the ball, but also his mindset. Gray would never be booked in his career, particularly incredible when you remember the Leeds side he played for. But not only this, Gray had extreme devotion to Leeds, despite having no relation to the club before he moved there. Gray would be willing to move deeper, playing as a left back in his later years, and would even take over as manager for their time in the second tier. He'd retire from playing in 1984 and would leave the club overall a year later, having failed to get Leeds promoted for the third season in a row. During Gray's time in charge of the club, many young players would come through the ranks, most notably Man United legend Dennis Irwin. Funnily enough, we'll actually have a Dennis Irwin video on the channel soon, which won't be made by me. In case you didn't know, it's not just me on this channel, so if you hear a different voice in the next video, don't worry, it's still a Wrlds Game video. In his playing career, injuries had limited Gray to just 12 Scotland caps. Gray had managed 3 goals in his games for the national team. Not too shabby for an injury-prone showboater. But of course, Gray wasn't just some showboater. Similarly to Neymar in the modern game, Eddie Gray should be remembered as a truly fantastic footballer in all aspects. The man who left no footprints certainly left a great legacy. If this was the first video you've seen of ours, please like and subscribe, and check out our other video essays. If you've made it this far in the video, fit the word bubble wrap into a comment. Best comments win a laugh and emoji apply from us, so there's a big incentive there. Thanks for watching and enjoy your day.